The invitation sat on my desk like something misplaced from another reality, a delicate cream card embossed with my name in elegant silver script, far too intimate and refined to have come from the office world of glass walls, controlled smiles, and impeccably tailored power. Yet there it was, handwritten in a style I instantly recognized because I had seen it only once before, years ago, on the corner of a whiteboard in a conference room when Evelyn Montgomery herself had scribbled a note beside a diagram, and now here I was, standing in the grand foyer of her Connecticut mansion, realizing this was not a dream or a mistake, but real, undeniably real, and every cell in my body felt it, the cool polished marble beneath my heels, the faint scent of cedar and apple spice drifting from somewhere deeper in the house, and the silence, not the sterile, heavy silence of corporate tension, but the soft kind of quiet that feels lived in, like music had just been playing or laughter had just faded or someone had just taken a long, deep breath and finally felt at home. The door had been opened by Evelyn herself, no assistant, no butler, no staff performing the usual pageantry that surrounded her in Manhattan, and for a second, I genuinely didn't recognize her, because the Evelyn Montgomery I had known for 3 years did not wear jeans, did not walk barefoot, did not have waves of chestnut hair falling freely across her shoulders, did not smile like the world wasn't watching. Yet this woman had bare feet against the warm wooden floor, a soft gray oversized sweater that draped around her like a blanket, and eyes not guarded or calculating, but warm, almost cautious, almost hopeful, like she was waiting for me to decide if I truly saw her or if I was still looking at the version she had built and sold and worn for years. "Jordan," she said, my name soft, almost unfamiliar in her voice because I was used to hearing it in boardrooms and hallways, clipped and professional, but now it sounded like something new, shaped by something tender, and for the first time I could not look at her without feeling something strange, something that hummed under my skin, like my body understood something before my mind did. There were no other cars in the driveway, no voices deeper in the house, no polished event lighting. Just 2 wine glasses on a dark wooden table, a half-prepared meal visible through an open doorway, and something in the air I could not name, something fragile, like if I spoke too loudly, it would break. She stepped back to let me in, and I felt the warmth of the house like a blanket wrapping around me, not the warmth of luxury heating, but the warmth of somewhere someone lived, really lived, not just existed. For 3 years, I had watched her exist. In boardrooms, she had been a monument, immovable, admirable, terrifying. In elevators, she had been silent ice. In company Christmas parties, she had been the kind of elegant no one approached, admired only from afar, like art behind glass. But here she was, sleeves pushed to her elbows, face free of makeup, hair slightly messy, and eyes that looked at me not like a boss, not like a CEO, but like a woman. "I hope you like Pinot Noir," she said, awkwardly, like someone who hadn't spoken casually in a while, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of this moment felt too big to hold without letting something escape. She blinked, then smiled, and I swear it felt like I had witnessed something no one else had seen. For a moment we just stood there, in her entryway, silent, and it didn't feel tense or uncomfortable, but suspended, like the world had paused to see what would happen next. My coat suddenly felt heavy, like I wasn't just taking it off my shoulders, but shedding something invisible too, and when she reached for it, her fingers brushed mine, quick, accidental, but enough to make my skin remember it later, quietly, even when my mind tried not to. She hung it in a closet, then hesitated at the door, as if debating whether to ask me something or say something, and finally, she didn't. She just smiled, small, unsure, and said, "Come on, the kitchen's this way," like we'd done this 1,000 times before, though we both knew we never had. The kitchen was nothing like I expected. It wasn't cold or metallic or overly modern like I'd imagined, knowing her taste from her Manhattan office, but warm, with wooden beams, copper pans, windows that overlooked trees covered in fading November leaves, and spices scattered across the counter, like she'd actually been cooking herself, a concept so absurd I almost questioned reality. She poured the wine, her hands slightly shaking, and I could tell not from nerves like mine, but from something else, something deeper, something like exposure. She wasn't hiding. Not tonight. Not with me. I don't usually do this, she said, eyes lowered, fingers tracing circles around her wine glass, and I understood immediately she wasn't talking about cooking or inviting employees to her home. She meant this, being seen. And I didn't know why she had chosen me. Of all people, me. But something in me softened in response. I don't usually do this either, I said, and she looked at me then, really looked, like she heard something in my voice she wasn't expecting. The fireplace in the next room crackled softly. The sky outside the windows was turning pink, then purple, then deep blue, and the room felt suspended in that twilight hour where nothing is fully one thing or another. Not day, not night, not professional, not personal, not safe, not dangerous. Just possibility. We talked. First about surface things, traffic, weather, mutual acquaintances. Then temperatures shifted, silently, like something invisible was moving between us, drawing us closer. She asked me about my family. I hesitated. Then I asked her about hers. She hesitated longer. Eventually, she said softly, I haven't celebrated Thanksgiving with anyone in 9 years. And something in my heart cracked open. She didn't say why, but her voice carried ghosts. And when I said, just as softly, I haven't either, she looked at me like she believed me, even though I never explained. We started cooking together. Not because she needed help, but because it felt easier to stand beside her than across from her. At first, we moved around each other carefully, like we were strangers, but soon our movements synced without effort, like some quiet rhythm had found us. She tasted sauce from a wooden spoon and held it out for me. Without thinking, I stepped closer. Without thinking, she lifted it to my lips. Without thinking, I let the taste linger longer than necessary. It didn't matter what the sauce tasted like. All I could taste was her. Conversation shifted too, from curated to real, from calculated to honest. I said things I didn't normally say in front of people like her, things about feeling small, overlooked, invisible. And before I could regret it, she said quietly, I know what it's like to be lonely in a room full of people. And something changed. Not outside. Inside. In the air. In her eyes. In mine. Hours passed like minutes. Wine glasses refilled slowly. Candles flickered, even though neither of us remembered lighting them. We moved from the kitchen to the dining room, though neither of us cared about the food as much as the fact that we were eating it together. She laughed, really laughed, at something I said, and it sounded rusty, as if it had been locked up too long. And I felt something strange, something I had never associated with Evelyn Montgomery before, the urge to protect her. Not from the world. From herself. After dessert, we ended up in the living room, sitting on the floor near the fireplace. Closer. Much closer. Her legs folded under her, hair falling loosely around her shoulders, eyes softer than I had ever seen them, and something in the silence between us felt louder than any words we could speak. Then she whispered, Do you ever feel like you've spent so much time being who you were expected to be that you forgot who you actually are? And I knew she wasn't talking to a manager or an employee or a colleague.
She was talking to me. Just me.
I did not answer immediately. I simply looked at her, really looked, and said, Maybe this is who you are. And in the firelight, I saw it. The moment she realized I wasn't just seeing her. I was choosing to. And maybe no one had in a very long time. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She just breathed, slowly, deeply, like something inside her had just unstretched its wings. And in that moment, something shifted between us in a way that neither of us could pretend not to feel. And though nothing happened, nothing physical, nothing reckless, everything had changed anyway. It was in the way her hand rested on the floor, inches from mine. In the way our breaths moved in sync. In the way neither of us looked away. She was not my CEO tonight. And I was not just her employee. We were two women who, for once, had stopped surviving, just long enough to feel something real. And neither of us was ready to let it go. Not after tonight. I hadn't expected to stay that late, but time moved strangely in Evelyn Montgomery's house, as though clocks ticked differently here, slower, gentler, like the world outside didn't quite exist beyond those windows that reflected nothing but darkness and the soft glow of candlelight. At some point, she stopped checking her phone, and so did I. At some point, the music that had been lightly playing in the background had faded, and neither of us bothered to restart it. At some point, the silence between us stopped being something to fill, and instead became something to feel. She sat curled on the floor near the fireplace, not on one of the expensive white armchairs, but on the thick rug, legs crossed, fingers lazily tracing the patterns in the fabric like she was grounding herself in something tangible. I mirrored her position across from her, though not intentionally. Somehow, our bodies synced on their own, falling into a rhythm that felt comfortable, unforced. For the first time since arriving, I realized how quiet the house really was. Not empty quiet, not lonely quiet, but safe quiet, like the kind that wraps itself around you and says stay a little longer. Maybe that was why I didn't rush to leave. Maybe that was why she didn't offer to drive me back. Maybe that was why, when the fireplace crackled softly and she glanced up with tired, softened eyes, I didn't say goodbye. I said, "Are you okay?" And she didn't flinch or close up or retreat behind the armor everyone else knew her by. She just let her shoulders fall, like the question had finally been asked by someone she trusted enough to answer honestly. The pause stretched, unhurried, delicate, full of unspoken truths. Then she whispered, "I don't really know who I am when I'm not being her," and it was the first time I heard her refer to the version of herself that ruled boardrooms, controlled investors, commanded attention, not as herself, but as someone separate, someone she wore like a uniform. My chest tightened because I understood more than I expected to. "Who do you want to be?" I asked softly. She looked at me, and there was something in her expression, a flicker of relief, maybe, or hope, or fear, that made my breath catch.
"Someone real," she said.
Not confident, not rehearsed, not composed, just honest, vulnerably, achingly honest. It felt like a confession. She stood slowly, like movement took effort, and walked to the window. Outside, the night was almost completely black, the outline of trees swaying in the wind, branches tapping lightly against the glass like whispers. In the faint reflection, I could see her watching herself, not the composed woman who led Fortune 500 companies, but this woman, barefoot and tired, and so visibly human. "People admire me," she said, still staring at her reflection. "They respect me. Some even fear me. But no one really sees me." I stood too, my feet sinking into the rug, and crossed the small distance between us. Not enough to touch, but enough to feel that strange electricity that had been quietly building all evening. "I see you," I said. And maybe it was reckless, or maybe it was exactly what needed to be said, because she turned not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, like she was letting the words settle inside her before she faced the person who spoke them. Her eyes didn't look seal-like. They didn't look controlled.
They looked raw, real,
almost shaken. "I know," she whispered. And for a moment, just a moment, we stood there in the kind of silence that makes your lungs feel too small for your breath. Neither of us moved, but everything between us did. That invisible line, the one that had faintly divided professionalism from something infinitely more dangerous and delicate, began to blur. She sat back down near the fireplace, and this time, I sat closer. Not accidentally. Not too close. But close enough for warmth to pass between us in quiet, careful waves. She didn't pull away. She didn't retreat. Instead, she reached for something on the coffee table, a small box, wooden, intricately carved, and held it with both hands like it was something sacred. "My sister gave me this," she said, her voice softer than the fire. "Before she left. Love what you've seen so far, and want to help me keep creating these awesome stories on this channel? Then subscribe and hit the bell. Your subscription supports the channel and makes sure you get more exciting stories." Before we stopped speaking, there were only a few pictures inside. Not glossy, professional photos, just simple, faded ones. 2 young girls in the snow, baking cookies in a messy kitchen, standing beside an old piano, smiling, real smiles, joyful, whole, family. Evelyn handed me one without explaining it. I studied it, noticing how young she looked. Barefoot in summer grass, hair loose and light, brightness in her eyes that I had never seen in the office. Untouched by expectation, unburdened by the weight she now carried every day. She walked away from this life, she said, barely loud enough for me to hear. Said she couldn't watch me become someone who never laughed anymore. I lifted my gaze from the picture to her. She was staring into the flames. I didn't ask why they stopped speaking. I didn't ask what happened next. Instead, I stayed quiet, because silence, I realized, was sometimes the only language gentle enough for certain truths. After a moment, she spoke again. I used to think loneliness was the price of success. She turned to look directly at me. And then, tonight, you walked in. The room went still. My heart did something strange, almost painful, because vulnerability doesn't just expose the one speaking, it changes the one listening too. I put the picture down gently, and before I could think, my hand reached out and rested lightly beside hers on the rug. Not touching, but close. The faintest distance. An invitation. A question. Not pressure. Not expectation. Just presence. Her pinky moved.
Slowly. Slightly.
Not enough to be intentional, but enough to feel like an answer. Neither of us looked away. Not for a second. The moment was fragile. Not romantic. Not yet. Just profoundly human. Deeper than anything either of us had expected to find tonight. Jordan, she whispered, not as a boss. Not as a woman in control. But as a woman simply saying my name, as if she liked the way it felt on her tongue. As if she didn't want to stop saying it. I didn't say anything back. I didn't need to. Because she understood. Somehow, without words, she understood that this, whatever this was, had just shifted into something neither of us could pretend was ordinary anymore. And when the firelight flickered across her face, casting warmth across her skin, I realized I had never seen her look more beautiful. Not at galas. Not at meetings. Not in her power suits. But here. Barefoot, bare-souled, entirely human. And for the first time all evening, I felt something unmistakable. Not just connection, not just empathy, but desire. Quiet, careful, deeply rooted desire. The kind that didn't demand, didn't rush, didn't burn too quickly. The kind that knew how to wait, and would, because something real had begun. And real things are worth waiting for. She lowered her hand, just slightly, until her fingers barely brushed mine. The gentlest contact. Brief, fleeting, yet earth-shattering in its softness. We both inhaled sharply. Then slowly, without breaking eye contact, she pulled away, only to say, barely audible, stay. I didn't answer with words. I just moved a little closer.
And that was enough.
The house felt different now. Not as a mansion or some architectural masterpiece worthy of magazine covers, not as the fortress of a woman admired, feared, and speculated about in corporate circles, but more like a diary made of walls and wood and light, one that had been closed for a very long time until tonight, when she chose, deliberately, to open its pages for me to read. I hadn't expected to explore beyond the kitchen, dining room, and living space, but Evelyn stood up softly, brushed her fingertips across the woven rug as though imprinting something there, and looked at me with that unreadable tenderness, the kind that didn't force or demand, but invited. "Let me show you something," she said, almost as if she were asking for permission. I followed her through the hallway, bare feet on warm wood floors, passing spaces that looked curated, but lived in, muted winter sunlight-colored walls, soft lamps glowing in corners, framed photos on a console table that didn't look staged, because some were slightly crooked and some had fingerprints smudged on the glass, the kind left behind when someone picks them up more than once, maybe more than they should. She stopped in front of a door near the end of the hall, hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, then gently turned the handle. It wasn't a bedroom or an office like I expected, but something quieter, more intimate. A music room. Small, simple, softly lit, almost cozy, with light wooden floors, a wide window looking out into the darkness, and at the center, an old mahogany upright piano, with sheet music scattered on top, slightly faded, slightly worn, like they had been played once, then abandoned, then sometimes remembered. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. She walked toward the piano and stopped just beside it, resting her hand lightly on the lid, fingers trailing across the smooth wood like she was touching something living. I used to play, she said, voice distant, but unlike before. This one wasn't guarded or masked. It was wistful, haunted by something soft and aching. I stepped closer, slow, careful, like approaching something fragile. Why did you stop? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes traced the shape of the instrument, the keys, the dent on the corner, maybe left by childhood carelessness or memory. Then finally, she said, because I stopped listening. I waited. Silence hummed between us like something alive. Then she looked up, and her eyes didn't look CEO-like, or composed, or resigned. They looked human. When the world expects you to be perfect, you stop doing things that remind you how beautifully imperfect you really are. It was in that moment I realized this wasn't just a piano. These weren't just rooms. This wasn't just a dinner. This night was her opening doors inside herself, letting me into spaces that had dust in the corners and untuned keys and faded memories, and she wasn't turning away or putting on armor when I looked. She was letting herself be seen. The quiet stretched, not empty but full, like something unnamed was growing between us, something gentle but powerful. I moved closer to the piano, close enough to stand beside her, without touching her but feeling her presence like heat, like something magnetic. Play something, I whispered, and my voice sounded different, quieter, softer, like it had lowered itself respectfully to match the sacredness of the moment. She looked at me with a kind of surprise, not because I asked, but because I asked gently, without expectation, without performance. And something in her softened again. So she sat down. Not gracefully or calculatedly like the Evelyn from the office, but slowly, like she was reacquainting herself with an old part of her that she hadn't visited in years. I sat beside her on the bench, though slightly turned away, giving her space, but not leaving her alone. She placed her fingers on the keys, but didn't press anything immediately. Instead, she just touched them, lightly, like stroking something delicate. Then, almost hesitantly, she began to play. The melody that emerged was soft, quiet, almost uncertain, but something about the way she released each note felt tender, like she wasn't just remembering a song, she was remembering herself. It was simple, imperfect, occasionally hesitating, occasionally trembling, but it was beautiful. So incredibly, achingly beautiful because it was real, unpolished, unmasked. I didn't realize I was watching her instead of listening until she turned slightly, and our eyes met, and something unspoken passed between us, something electric but soft, something that said, "You don't have to be perfect to be seen." When she finished, her fingers lingered on the keys, and the silence that followed felt like the end of something, or maybe the beginning. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, she traced her fingertip along one of the chipped keys and whispered, "I don't let anyone see this room." My breath caught, not because of what she said, but because of what it meant. She didn't just show me a room. She showed me a part of herself. Slowly, carefully, she turned toward me, and we were still close, but something was different now. Gravity had shifted. Something had deepened between us. My pulse quickened as her eyes searched mine, not for approval, not for admiration, but for understanding. And maybe something else. Something far more dangerous. Something far more true. I wanted to reach for her hand. For a moment, I thought she might reach for mine. The space between our fingers felt alive, charged, like a breathing thing. No words, no movements, just suspended awareness. Then, not abruptly, but gently like a slow exhale, she stood, letting her hand drift away from the piano, but not from me. She walked to the far wall, where there was a door I hadn't seen before, part glass, part wood, and opened it. A garden. A winter garden lit by tiny string lights, faintly golden. Not perfectly manicured, not staged, but alive in a quiet, honest way. Faded yellow roses climbing vines, wilted lavender, a wooden bench, and a fountain trickling softly. I don't let anyone hear either, she said, without turning around. But I was already walking toward her. She stepped outside, into the chilly November air, and I followed. It wasn't cold enough to hurt, but cold enough to make you aware of your own warmth. She wrapped her arms around herself, and without thinking, I gently extended my arm, offering her my cardigan. She shook her head, then paused, then took it, not because she needed it, but because I offered it. That mattered. We sat on the bench, close, but not touching. The cold air made our breaths visible, little clouds between us mingling before disappearing. Do you regret it? I asked softly. She turned her head. Regret what? Becoming her, I said, not with judgment, but with quiet honesty. The woman the world saw. The woman she wore like armor. She didn't look away this time. I don't regret who I became, she whispered. I regret what I had to lose to become her. And there it was.
The ache.
The truth. She blinked slowly, as though letting that truth finally sit where it belonged. In the open, not hidden away. And when she looked at me again, her expression didn't just soften. It changed, like she had just made a decision.
But she didn't say it. She didn't need to.
It was there in her eyes, in the closeness of our hands, in the way she didn't flinch when I finally, gently, let my fingers rest near hers, not touching, but available. The first raindrop fell softly on the wooden railing. Then another. Then another. She didn't move. Neither did I. We stayed until the rain grew steady and our shoulders brushed. Not intentionally, not quite accidentally, but somewhere in between. Neither of us moved away. A moment later, so soft it felt imagined, her pinky brushed against mine.
Once.
Slowly. And this time, she didn't pull away. We didn't speak. We didn't kiss. We didn't even hold hands. But something far more intimate happened. We stayed. Not because we had to. Because neither of us wanted to leave when we finally felt seen. Not admired. Not respected. Not feared.
Seen.
Two small words broke the silence. Not quite a question. Not quite a plea. Stay longer, she whispered. And I answered without speaking. I simply stayed. It should have been late enough to say goodbye, to thank her for dinner, and the warmth of conversation, and the quiet but undeniable connection that had settled between us like a shared breath, but neither of us made any move toward ending the night. Time had stopped behaving like time the moment I stepped through her door hours earlier, and even now, in the dim glow of her winter garden, with rain gently tapping against the glass and our shoulders close enough to share warmth without actually touching, everything felt suspended, soft, fragile, deliberate. Evelyn looked different now, not only because she was out of the armor she usually wore in Manhattan boardrooms, but because something deeper had changed. She wasn't performing. She wasn't calculating. She wasn't protecting herself from being seen. She was simply there.
Real. Quiet.
Vulnerable in a way I felt privileged to witness. When she finally stood, it was not to leave, but to lead us back inside, moving slowly as though she feared sudden motion might break the delicate trust that had formed between us. I followed her through the hall, past the music room and the soft glow of the kitchen lights, until we reached a small sitting room I hadn't seen before, less curated, less intentional, more human. There were throw blankets, half-read books, a mug on a side table that looked like it had been abandoned mid-thought, and in the corner, near the large window that overlooked the faint gardens, there were canvases propped against the wall, paintbrushes in jars, and traces of color on a drop cloth pooled over the hardwood floor. I stopped.
She didn't speak. She didn't need to.
The surprise that bloomed in my chest must have been visible on my face, because she gave a small, almost embarrassed smile, one that made her look younger, softer, beautifully unguarded. You paint, I said, my voice quiet, not wanting to break anything sacred about this discovery. She looked almost shy, a word I never would have thought to associate with Evelyn Montgomery before tonight. I used to, she said, and even in those two words, I heard it, longing, nostalgia, loss. I haven't in years. I moved toward one of the canvases, noticing it wasn't something abstract or coldly modern, the type of art that looked expensive but emotionally hollow. This was different. A blurry figure. A girl in a field. Barefoot.
Free.
Laughing, maybe, though her face wasn't clear. But her body language, unfettered joy. Unburdened. Untethered. Someone real. Someone alive. Someone who didn't exist in the marble halls of corporate empires where Evelyn now ruled. Someone she used to be. Is that you? I asked. She hesitated for a long moment, then nodded. Slowly. Quietly. It was, she said. She sat on the floor without thinking, legs folded to the side, and I did the same, both of us facing the painting like it was a memory rather than an object. Where is she? I asked softly, still looking at the girl in the painting running through the grass, barefoot and laughing like sunlight. Evelyn leaned her head back against the wall, eyes tracing the outline of the girl. She learned how to be perfect, she whispered, and never quite found her way back. We sat there in silence for several minutes. Not the kind of silence that feels empty or awkward, but the kind that is full, sacred, like the moment before something breaks open. I finally turned to her. What happened to your sister? I asked gently, not probing, but offering her a door she could walk through if she wanted. Her breath caught. Just faintly. But I felt it. Heard it. She didn't look away.
Not this time.
She left, she whispered, eyes fixed on the window where rain was softly blurring the view of the garden. She left because she said I was disappearing, even though I was everywhere. Always in meetings. Always making deals. Always winning. Always succeeding. But disappearing. She clasped her hands together in her lap, not tightly, not nervously, but as if holding something invisible, something fragile. She said I stopped showing up as myself, and eventually, she didn't know who she was trying to love anymore. That word.
Love.
Not romantic. Something deeper. Unconditional. Sisterhood. Home.
But lost.
I told her she was wrong. Evelyn continued, voice trembling so slightly, I almost thought I imagined it. I told her that you don't have to be seen to matter. That visibility isn't the same as meaning. That purpose doesn't always come with warmth. A faint, broken smile ghosted across her lips. She said that was the saddest thing she'd ever heard. A tear didn't fall, but one formed. Not dramatic. Not desperate. Just a tear that existed because something ached too deeply to remain dry. So she packed her things, Evelyn whispered, and only looked back once. And then she wasn't speaking to me anymore. She was speaking to memory.
To time.
To someone she had once been. To someone she had once loved. And in that moment, I understood something that made my breath catch. She didn't show me this room because it was beautiful. She showed me because it was the truest. It was the room where she once allowed herself to feel.
To create.
To exist outside perfection. And tonight, she had chosen to let me in. Not because I worked for her. Not because I had proven myself worthy in some professional capacity. But because something in her trusted something in me. And it wasn't logical. Or safe. Or planned. It was simply human. When she finally looked at me, that tear hadn't fallen. But it remained there, quietly, like something not ashamed anymore. Do you miss her? I asked. The answer was too big for words. But her silence told me everything. It was then that the moment changed, not because we moved, not because we touched, but because something about the air shifted, like the distance between us had finally given up on trying to stay. She blinked, slow, like waking from a long sleep. Then she whispered, small, honest, uncalculated, why does it feel like you've been here before? I didn't answer right away, because I knew she wasn't asking about the house, or the room, or even the night. She was asking why this connection, this sense of being seen, felt somehow familiar, even though we had never stood this close as ourselves before. And the only answer that felt true was, because maybe we've both been waiting to be seen for a very long time. Her breath trembled. Not broken, not fragile, but relieved. Like something inside her had just loosened, finally. She didn't reach for me. She didn't break the space between us, but her eyes did something far more intimate.
They stayed.
I hadn't realized how close we had moved until I felt the warmth between us. Quiet, magnetic, waiting. She looked at my mouth, not with hunger, not with impatience, not even with intention, but with quiet awareness. And something inside me responded, not rushed, not reckless, not romantic, but real. My hand moved, somehow, slowly,
Carefully.
to rest on the floor beside hers. Just like the moment in the garden. An unspoken offering. A question. Not a request. Not a push. Just presence. Her pinky shifted, soft, slow, brushing mine like before, but this time lingering. Just a moment longer. A breath longer. Eyes still holding mine. Not looking away. And I knew, in that moment, that we were both standing at the edge of something inevitable. Not dramatic. Not explosive. But deeply true. She exhaled, slow, like letting go of something she didn't need anymore. And her voice, barely above a whisper, asked, "Jordan, do you ever wonder what would happen if, for once, we stopped protecting ourselves?" My heart didn't race.
It didn't panic.
It simply settled, like it had found something it recognized. I leaned in, not enough to close the distance, but enough to acknowledge it. Enough to say without words, yes. Yes, I wonder. And I'm willing to find out. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to feel. And I knew in that moment that tonight was not about falling in love. Tonight was about learning how to feel without fear. And that, sometimes, is even more intimate than a kiss.
So, we did not kiss.
We did not touch. We stayed, eyes open, walls down. And everything had changed. Again. The moments that followed did not rush forward like scenes in a movie, loud or dramatic or punctuated with sudden declarations, but instead unfolded with a kind of stillness, a slow-motion awareness of air and warmth and breath and presence, as though both of us were learning how to exist differently now, no longer behind carefully guarded facades, but inside something tender, fragile, quietly unfolding, and somehow safe. Evelyn didn't speak for a long while after the almost confession, not verbally at least, but in the language of glances, pauses, and deliberate stillness. She said 100 things, maybe more, things that didn't need syllables, because they lived too deep for that. She stayed where she was, sitting quietly on the floor of the art room, her fingers loosely interlaced, not quite touching mine but close enough that I felt her presence, like an open door. I understood something then. She was not afraid of feeling. She was afraid of letting someone else see her feel. Tonight was the first time she had allowed it. And somehow, impossibly, she had chosen me to see it. Eventually, she stood, not abruptly, not nervously, but slowly, like someone returning to their body after being lost deep in their thoughts. And I stood too, neither of us speaking, but both moving with an unspoken understanding that the night was not over. We left the art room together, footsteps quiet against the wooden floor, and walked deeper into the house, through a hallway that grew dimmer and quieter, until we reached a space I hadn't seen before, a room made almost entirely of glass. Not a greenhouse, not exactly a conservatory, but something in between, a glass-walled room that extended out into the garden, framed by tall windows and faint silver light, the moon reflecting softly on surfaces, the faint glimmer of rainwater still lingering on the panes from earlier. It felt like a space meant not for entertaining, not for impressing, not for working, but for breathing, for existing, for feeling. She didn't turn on the lights. The room didn't need them. The pale moonlight was enough. Quiet, silver, honest. She stepped inside, barefoot on the cool stone tiles, and exhaled so softly that I might have missed it had I not been watching her so closely. "This," she whispered, gaze drifting to the faint outline of the garden fading into darkness, "is where I come when I forget how to breathe." I didn't move closer. Not yet. Something about the moment felt holy. Not sacred in a religious sense, but in the sense of quiet reverence, the kind that makes you slow your movements, lower your voice, soften your presence, because something important is happening and you don't want to disturb it. She walked to the far side of the glass room, where a single wooden chair sat facing the garden, worn, simple, unpretentious, utterly unlike everything else in her curated, immaculate world. She touched the back of the chair with her fingertips, almost absently, then turned to me. "People think loneliness is being alone," she said, voice soft, eyes reflecting moonlight. "It isn't. Loneliness is being unseen." My breath caught, not because the words were profound, but because they were true. So deeply true. And she hadn't ever said them to anyone. I knew that. I felt it. She turned away again, but this time, not as retreat, but as invitation, giving me space to step forward if I wanted to.
And I did. Slowly, carefully, deliberately.
Until I stood beside her, not touching, but only a breath apart, both of us looking at the quiet garden beyond the glass, both of us seeing more than just trees or moonlight or the faint shimmer of rain on the window.
She was close now.
I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, feel the subtle shift in her breathing as she became aware of our nearness, that we were standing in the closest proximity we ever had before, and that something had changed, not suddenly, but irreversibly. Her arms weren't folded like before. Her shoulders weren't stiff. She stood softer now, more open, more real. The moonlight touched her hair, casting faint silver threads through the chestnut strands, making her look both ethereal and deeply human all at once. She wasn't Evelyn Montgomery, CEO. Not here. Not right now. She was just Evelyn, a woman haunted by her own perfection, meeting herself again through the eyes of someone who wasn't trying to fix her or worship her or protect her, but simply stay. She turned slowly, her eyes finding mine. There was no performance in them, no guarding, just truth, and something that felt like relief. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" she asked, not harshly, not egoistically, but vulnerably, like she genuinely didn't understand. My throat tightened. I didn't rush to speak. Instead, I let the silence hold the moment. And then, "Because you don't scare me," I whispered. "You move me." Her breathing changed. Not sharply, but deeply, slowly. Her eyes glistened, not with tears exactly, but with something softer, something warm, something that felt like recognition. And this time, finally, intentionally, meaningfully, she didn't just stand close. She stepped closer. So close I could feel her breath warm against my skin, could see every flicker of emotion moving behind her eyes, could sense the hesitation. Not because she didn't want to be close, but because she wanted it too much to rush it. My heartbeat pulsed softly between us. The world felt small and vast all at once. I felt the gravity shift again, and this time, neither of us resisted. She reached out, not to grab, not to claim, not to rush, but to offer. Her fingers trembled, barely brushing my wrist, so lightly I might have imagined it, except I didn't, because I felt my body respond in a way words couldn't describe, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. She paused, giving me time, space, to step back if I wanted to pull away, to protect us both from something that might be too real. I didn't step back. Instead, I moved a fraction, just a fraction closer. Enough to answer. Enough to say without words, "I'm not going anywhere." And that was all she needed. Slowly, gently, she let her hand slide down my wrist until her fingers found mine. Not interlaced, not yet, but resting together, palm to palm, nothing rushed, nothing forced, but deliberate, tender, and so achingly human it felt more intimate than any kiss could have been. Her fingers curled, not possessively, but like a confession. And I felt it, not in my skin but somewhere deeper, somewhere truer. She breathed out, shaky. I breathed in, steady. And something between us aligned, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, quietly. She didn't cry. I didn't cry. But something inside both of us recognized something we had been missing for a very long time. A moment passed, or a lifetime did. I couldn't tell. And then, slowly, without thinking, without planning, without anything but truth guiding us, she stepped into me. Not fully. Not to fuse. Just enough for her forehead to gently rest against my shoulder. It was not an embrace yet. It was trust embodied. It was permission. It was somehow everything. My arms didn't move at first. I was afraid to break the sacred stillness of the moment. But then I let one arm rise, slowly, gently, to rest across her back, lightly, open-handed, supportive, not possessive. She didn't pull away. She exhaled. Fully. And for the first time all night, I felt her weight, not physically, but emotionally, like she had finally stopped holding herself up alone. The embrace was not dramatic or tight or desperate. It was fragile, honest, trembling, and more intimate than any passionate kiss could have been, because it wasn't about desire. It was about allowing oneself to be held and to hold. Her voice, faint against my shoulder. I don't even know the last time I did this. You don't have to remember, I whispered. You're doing it now. She didn't answer, but I felt her nod. Very faintly, slowly, she lifted her head, not leaving the embrace, but just enough to look at me. And suddenly, the closeness felt electric. Her breath was warm. Her hair brushed my cheek. Her eyes, soft, open, deeply human, held mine. I could feel it now, the possibility of a kiss, not rushed, not forced, but inevitable.
Close.
So close. Not a question of if, only when. But she didn't lean in, and neither did I, because something else was happening here, something more important than a kiss. We were learning how to be real. And when she whispered, "Stay, please," I didn't answer with words. I simply stayed. And that, somehow, was the most intimate thing of all. The embrace had not fully ended when the world around us shifted, not literally, not with movement or sound, but with something quieter, something invisible, as though the air itself had decided that whatever had been growing between us was no longer subtle, no longer a flicker beneath the surface, but something alive, present, undeniable. It didn't rush forward, didn't erupt into something dramatic or physical. Instead it deepened, like roots quietly sinking into soil, unseen but irreversible. Evelyn remained close, her forehead still near the curve of my shoulder, her breath soft and unhurried, the kind of breathing people do only when they feel safe enough to stop performing. When she finally pulled back, it was not to create distance, but to look at me, really look, with eyes no longer only soft but searching, as though she were memorizing something she hadn't realized could matter, something that had nothing to do with roles or titles or expectations. Something human. "I don't know why it feels like I've known you longer than I have," she whispered, voice quiet, almost wondering, like she was afraid to examine the feeling too closely in case it dissolved in her hands. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew that rushing to fill silence would take away from the power of it. So I stayed quiet, present, and she seemed to understand that silence, when safe, could be a kind of conversation too. Her fingers brushed mine again, slow, deliberate, never fully holding, always lingering just long enough to feel like possibility rather than certainty. There was something intensely intimate about the restraint, the carefulness, the way she let things breathe. She didn't move away, but she did shift, gently lowering herself onto the small couch in the glass room, the moonlight spilling across her face like silvery water, and after a pause that wasn't hesitation but invitation, I sat beside her.
Close.
But not touching. The kind of closeness that felt louder than an embrace. She didn't speak for a long time, and I didn't push her to. Instead, I waited, watching the way her gaze drifted past the glass walls to the garden, where rain still shimmered on leaves and stone paths, as though the world outside was listening too. Finally, she spoke. Not about business, not about surface things, but in that voice from earlier, the one that carried memory and ache. "I didn't always live alone," she said, and though it was a simple sentence, something about it felt like a door opening. "There was a time I thought I would share my life with someone. Not because it was expected, not because it looked good, but because it felt right." She didn't look at me, but I sensed her watching in small ways, the tilt of her head, the softness of her shoulder, the shift of her breath. "I loved someone," she whispered, and my heart didn't drop in jealousy. That wasn't what it felt like. Instead, it softened, because of the way she said it, like she wasn't recalling romance, but loss. She was the only person who ever looked at me and didn't see potential, or ambition, or image, or promise. She just saw me. The way she looked at me at that moment said more than her words did. I didn't speak. I listened. We were young, she continued. Too young to understand what sacrifice meant. Too young to know that success could be a cage, even if you're the one building it. She swallowed, but not like she was fighting tears, more like she was swallowing something old, something she had never quite named. We had everything ahead of us. Until I started believing that ahead mattered more than now. The silence after that wasn't heavy. It was heartbreaking in its stillness. She folded her hands loosely in her lap, and when she continued, it was softer. She asked me, once, if I believed I could be loved and powerful at the same time. A faint, humorless laugh. I told her it was naive to think so. My chest tightened. For her, for the younger version of her, for the woman sitting beside me now who looked like she had spent years trying to reconcile what she once rejected. So, she said she hoped one day I would be brave enough to find out. And did you? I asked, so quietly that my voice barely felt like my own. She didn't answer immediately. But then, slowly, she turned to me. And this time, when she looked, the CEO was gone entirely. I think, she whispered, that I stopped being brave the moment I became perfect. I didn't mean to move closer, it just happened. Not dramatically. Not boldly. Just naturally, like breath aligning. Evelyn, I said, not to correct, not to comfort, but simply to acknowledge her. Not the version she showed the world. Her. And it was her name that did it, not the touch, not the proximity, not the quiet. Her name, said by someone who saw her without asking her to perform. That was the invitation. That was permission. She didn't cry. But something in her did loosen. Finally, gently, like she had been holding her breath for a decade and only just remembered how to exhale. When she finally reached for me, it wasn't careful or cautious like the earlier touches. It was slow, yes, but certain this time, deliberate as her hand found mine, not brushing, not hovering, holding. Not tightly, not possessively, but fully, present. And she didn't let go. I didn't let go either. The silence swelled. Not between us, but around us, like the air itself was making room for whatever was happening. She turned slightly toward me, and I toward her, and for a long moment, we simply breathed the same quiet air, holding hands in a way that felt more intimate than any embrace ever could. And then, because we were there, because it was time, because neither of us pulled away, her free hand rose, slowly, trembling just enough to tell the truth that her face would not. She reached for my cheek, not touching, hovering, but the intention was unmistakable. A question, but not a request. An invitation, but not a demand. And everything in me rose to meet it. My breath caught, not in panic, but in recognition. Because suddenly, the nearness of her felt different than before. Not speculative. Not suggested. Not possible. Inevitable. I didn't close the distance. I didn't attempt to kiss her. But I didn't move away either. And that somehow was enough. She didn't drop her hand. But she didn't move closer either. We were frozen in that exquisite space between intention and action, between possibility and consequence. Her eyes found mine. Soft, searching, afraid, hopeful. And something in them, something wordless, whispered, if we cross this line, it will change everything. And something in mine whispered back, let it. But before anything more could happen, before touch could become meaning, before possibility could become truth, she pulled away. Not abruptly, not in fear, not in regret, but with reverence. She didn't break the connection. She protected it. She lowered her hand slowly, eyes still on mine, voice barely audible. Not yet, she whispered. And I understood. We were close, but we weren't ready to rush. What was happening wasn't fleeting. It wasn't fragile. It was becoming. And sometimes becoming takes time. She leaned back, not away, just enough to breathe. And when I looked at her, really looked, I didn't see hesitation or doubt or retreat. I saw something infinitely more meaningful. I saw choice. And not just hers.
Ours.
We stayed like that for a long time. No words needed. Fingers still intertwined. Breaths still somewhat shared. Something quietly unfolding between us. Deeper than closeness. Deeper than desire. Not love. Not yet. But something that would become love if allowed. And for the first time all night, I knew this story was not going to be about falling fast. It was going to be about falling true. The night was no longer night. Not in the usual sense. Not bound to hours or clocks or minutes or anything measurable, but transformed, stretched into something timeless, something that didn't move forward or backward, something that simply existed, suspended around us like a breath we didn't need to end. We were still in the glass room, hands gently but intentionally still intertwined, bodies close but never quite touching except for where skin met skin, where fingers rested in quiet companionship, and I realized we had stopped talking in words and started talking in something else, something softer, deeper, spoken in glances, pauses, breaths, the tilt of a head, the softness of a gaze held too long. And in that space where words didn't quite belong, there was a sense of safety I had not expected, not in her presence, not with someone who once existed only as authority, power, distance, perfection. She had shifted completely, and so had I, as though the versions of us that had walked into this house hours ago had quietly and willingly stepped outside and closed the door behind them, leaving only the ones who were real, the ones who felt without knowing how to say it, the ones who didn't ask to be seen but no longer resisted it either. Eventually, she spoke, not confessional, not heavy, simply thoughtful, reflective. "You know," she murmured, her voice sounding almost sleepy, though I could see in her eyes she was fully awake, completely present. "I don't think I've laughed like a real person in years. Not politely. Not socially. I mean laughed." My heart warmed at that, not because she said it, but because I could feel it was true. She didn't wait for me to respond. Instead, she allowed a soft, small smile to appear on her lips, and something inside me responded, smiling with her. Then, without thinking, she said, "Will you help me remember how?" And that moment, God, that moment felt like something impossible. Not dramatic, not romantic, not even grand, but devastatingly intimate, because she wasn't asking for entertainment, or distraction, or reassurance. She was asking me to help her feel alive again. I didn't say yes. I just let my thumb gently move across the back of her hand, the smallest, most tender motion, permission, agreement, presence. Something flickered in her expression. Gratitude, maybe, relief. She didn't let go. That mattered. Then, almost unexpectedly, she stood, but she didn't pull away from me. In fact, she held my hand intentionally this time, leading me through the hallway, past the sitting room, past the abandoned wine glasses now almost empty, like remnants of a world we'd already left behind, and I followed because that was what tonight had become. Not a question of where we were going, but a question of how it would feel when we arrived. We ended up in the kitchen again, but it felt different from earlier. Before, it had felt like the staging ground, the unexpected beginning. Now it felt like something else entirely, warmer, softer, like it had taken a deep breath after hours of holding its breath, like it knew something had shifted, settled. The room had changed, or maybe we had. Only one small lamp glowed now, throwing amber warmth across the counter where spices, flour, and abandoned utensils still lay from their earlier use. Evelyn let go of my hand not to retreat, but to move toward the counter, where she absently touched a wooden spoon, a mixing bowl, a dish towel, objects so ordinary, so strikingly human. She laughed softly, gently, and perfectly beautifully. And it wasn't the carefully measured, socially acceptable kind of laugh I had heard her use at galas or charity dinners. It was light, unscripted, almost shy. "We made a mess," she said. And I don't know why, but it felt like the most beautiful sentence I'd ever heard. "We did," I replied, smiling. She turned, leaning casually against the counter in a way I had never seen her standing before, relaxed, barefoot, sweater sleeves slightly pushed up, hair loose against her collarbone. Her posture no longer guarded or perfectly composed, but natural, soft, quietly alive. She looked younger, not in the sense of years, but in the sense of spirit. And for a moment, it became so obvious to me that I wondered how I hadn't seen it sooner. This wasn't a woman who needed perfection. This was a woman who needed real, needed warm, needed safe. Her eyes softened. "I'm hungry," she said suddenly. But the way she said it didn't refer to food. We both felt it. We both knew. Still, I glanced toward the kitchen island, where a bowl of fruit sat untouched, and raised an eyebrow. "You want to eat at?" I checked the clock. 2:47 a.m.? She smiled again, a little wider, a little freer. "I want pancakes." I blinked, and then, without meaning to, I laughed. A real laugh. One I hadn't planned or measured. She looked startled at first, then delighted. Completely delighted. I nodded, stepping closer. "Do you even know how to make pancakes?" She tilted her head, smiled. "I know how to order them." I laughed again, and she looked almost mesmerized, like she was trying to memorize the sound. I moved to the pantry. She followed. And for the next few minutes, we mixed flour and eggs and milk. Well, mostly I mixed, while she pretended to help but mostly just watched, smiling in that soft, private kind of way that had belonged only to this night. At one point, I got flour on my wrist. At one point after that, she reached out very slowly and brushed it away.
Gently.
Intentionally. Not because it needed to be cleaned,
But because she wanted to.
and that felt infinitely more intimate than I could have prepared for. We didn't speak much after that.
Didn't need to.
Everything was said through proximity. Through her fingers brushing mine when I handed her the spoon. Through the way I moved just a little too close when leaning past her for sugar. Through the way her breathing shifted every time our shoulders came close to touching.
There was ease now.
Familiarity. Yet also awareness. We were standing close. Too close. Not accidentally. Not innocently. Not unknowingly. At one point, she was standing behind me, watching the pan, and her hand, very lightly, rested on the counter beside mine. Not touching. Not quite. But close enough that I could feel every millimeter of the space between us. My breath wavered.
Subtly.
But she noticed. Of course she noticed. She stepped closer. Not entirely, but enough that I felt her warmth behind me, steady, soft, unhurried. She didn't rush.
She didn't press.
She didn't whisper anything romantic or poetic. She simply said, very quietly, "You feel calm to me." And I didn't know what to say, because that was one of the most intimate things anyone had ever said to me.
So I didn't speak.
I turned around instead, very, very slowly, until I was facing her. And there it was, the moment. Not the kiss. Not yet. But the moment before it. The one where the world is holding its breath, where desire is not yet spoken but fully understood, where both people know but neither crosses the line, not because of hesitation, but because what's building between them is too sacred to rush. We were so close. Not touching, but feeling everything. She met my eyes. I met hers. The air felt electric, but not frantic, magnetic, natural. Felt like it was always meant to happen this way, slowly, gently, truthfully. Her eyes lowered to my mouth. My heartbeat tripped. She looked back up, soft, warm, undoubtedly certain now. And in that moment, there was no performance. No fear. No mask. No armor. Just two women, very close, in a quiet kitchen at 3 a.m., feeling something true. She whispered, so quietly it felt like part of my own heartbeat. "Jordan." I forgot how to breathe. She took another breath, and I swear, the way she breathed felt like a decision. But then, before the moment could become something irreversible, she stepped back. Not far. Not in panic. Not in regret. Just enough. Enough to protect what was happening. Enough to say, not tonight. Not yet. We both stood still. Hearts loud. Breath soft. And she smiled, not a deflection. Not a mask. A real, beautifully, impossibly real smile. And in that smile was the truth. I want this. I'm not afraid of this, but I want it to mean something.
And that was enough.
More than enough. So we didn't kiss. We sat instead, at the kitchen island, eating pancakes at nearly 4 in the morning, barefoot, smiling, occasionally brushing hands, quietly laughing, and sharing something that felt sweeter, deeper, and more impossible than any rushed romance could have ever offered. And in a moment that didn't look like much at all, but felt like everything, she reached across the counter, gently, and said, "Stay until morning?" And I said, without hesitation, yes. And something inside both of us finally exhaled. Morning didn't arrive with noise or brightness or alarm clocks, but with a softness that felt almost unreal, like the world outside had gently begun to wake without disturbing whatever was happening inside that house, inside that glass room of warmth, breath, and quiet unfolding connection. There were no birds yet, only the faintest pale silver of dawn pushing gently against the edges of the night sky, and in that light, Evelyn looked different, calmer, slower, stripped of even more layers than the night before. Not someone unraveling, but someone returning, softly, without apology. We had fallen asleep neither in the bed nor the couch, but somewhere in between, somewhere in the quiet, halfway across the glassroom floor, side by side, still wrapped in quiet conversation that had long drifted into silence, not because we had run out of words, but because the words had run out of necessity. Her head had eventually tilted until it rested lightly against my shoulder and mine against hers, and I remembered wondering, in the last moments of waking, if I had ever felt so seen without being looked at. The sun had not fully risen when she stirred, slowly, her breath shifting just enough for me to know she was awake before she moved. She didn't sit up immediately. Her fingers remained resting loosely around mine, not tightly, not possessively, simply present. When her eyes opened, she didn't jolt into self-awareness the way someone used to control would have. She didn't panic at vulnerability. She just woke.
Softly.
Honestly. And looked at me not with embarrassment or hesitation, but with something else. Something true. "Good morning," she whispered, voice still woven with sleep, with memory, with warmth. Those 2 words, so simple, somehow felt like an entirely new language spoken for the very first time. "Good morning," I answered, just as softly, and the words felt heavier than they should have, like they carried more meaning than they usually did, because they didn't just mean morning, they meant we stayed. We didn't run when things got close. We didn't hide once the masks were gone. We stayed. And morning found us still here. She sat up slowly, finally, and so did I, both of us wordless for a moment, looking out at the garden now washed in faint morning light, dew shimmering on the leaves, glass panels breathing soft reflections. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a casual gesture except that it wasn't casual at all, not when everything about her had previously been measured and controlled. Now she just moved, naturally, without thinking, without rehearsing, without folding herself back into the version the world expected. She looked free. Not entirely, not perfectly, but beginning to be. "I don't usually let people see me in the morning," she said, barely smiling, almost shy. It wasn't vanity. There was no embarrassment in her voice, but something more vulnerable. Not wanting to be seen before she had put herself back together. But today, she hadn't yet put herself back together.
And she didn't seem to want to.
"I like you like this," I said before I could stop myself. But the truth of it was too real to regret. Her eyes lifted, and there it was, the flicker, the quiet shift from guardedness to something warmer. She didn't look away. "I like me like this," she said. And God, that felt more intimate than anything that had happened between us so far. More intimate than the hand-holding, the almost kiss, even the quiet night-long closeness. Because it wasn't me she was trusting. It was herself. And that was everything. We barely spoke for a while after that. We didn't need to. There was a kind of sacredness to that morning stillness that felt too fragile to interrupt. Instead, we made tea in the kitchen, barefoot, quiet, soft laughter occasionally slipping into the silence, not to fill it, but to decorate it. She watched the kettle as it warmed on the stove, and I watched her. Not staring, not observing, but witnessing, the way one witnesses something rare and beautiful and unrepeatable. The light through the windows wasn't gold yet, it was pale, silvery, picking up the quiet textures of her sweater, the delicate movements of her hands, the softness around her eyes. It was human light. "What are you thinking about?" I asked her gently when I saw that her gaze had drifted toward the windows, mind elsewhere. She didn't pretend not to understand. She didn't brush it off. She just answered. "About how peaceful this feels," she whispered. "And how terrifying." I nodded, because I understood. We weren't just standing in a kitchen. We were standing in the thin, sacred space between what had been and what could be, between fear of losing control and hope of being known. And in that space, she turned to me, slowly, fully, and looked at me, not cautiously or curiously like the night before, but steadily, openly. Something had changed. Something had settled. And whatever it was, it looked like readiness. No rush. No grand declarations. No rehearsals. Just readiness. She stepped toward me, not dramatically, but softly, the way someone approaches something they've waited for. Not to claim, but to honor. We weren't inches apart now. We weren't hesitant. We were simply near enough to feel warmth exchange, breath blend, heartbeats align. She lifted her hand, not trembling now, and touched the side of my face, slowly, tenderly, like she was making sure I was real. "Jordan," she whispered, and the way she said my name made my breath catch, because it wasn't a question or a warning or an invitation. It was simply recognition. And then finally, she leaned in, not urgently, not hungrily, not suddenly, but gently, so gently, like she was learning how to kiss for the first time, not because she didn't know how, but because this time she wanted to feel every second of it, remember every breath. Her lips touched mine like a secret being told slowly, reverently, and it wasn't fireworks or lightning or any of the things movies promised. It was better. It was quiet.
And deep.
And unbearably soft. The kind of kiss you feel long after it's over. Something inside me stilled. Not excitement, not adrenaline, but something like peace, like, oh, there you are. We didn't rush it. We didn't deepen it. It wasn't that kind of kiss. It was the kind that said, I see you. I choose you. I trust you. And when she finally pulled back, she didn't step away. She didn't hide. Her forehead rested lightly against mine, her thumb brushing the edge of my jaw, her breaths unsteady but calm. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression not intense or dramatic, but quietly full. "That," she whispered, voice barely there, "felt like breathing." And I whispered back, "It was." And just like that, morning arrived, fully, gently, beautifully, not with noise, but with light. And with something new that neither of us dared name yet. But we would.
Soon.
The kiss lingered long after it ended, not physically, but in the way breaths linger between memories and moments that are too soft to hold and too important to let go of, and neither of us moved immediately afterward, as though our bodies understood that whatever had just happened could not be rushed into definition or labeled too quickly, or dissected the way one might examine an event, because it wasn't an event, it was a shift. Something that quietly altered where we stood, not in distance, but in truth. Evelyn didn't pull away after the kiss, but she didn't move closer either. She simply remained there, forehead lightly resting against mine, eyes closed, breathing with me, like we had discovered something we didn't quite know how to name yet, but had no intention of denying. When she finally opened her eyes, the room looked different. Not brighter, not clearer, but warmer, like something had been thawed that had long been frozen. She didn't look away, didn't retreat behind composure or poise or the polished exterior she wore so flawlessly in every boardroom and interview and photograph. Instead, she watched me with an openness that felt almost reverent, like she was memorizing something, trying to understand how it was possible that something so gentle could feel so powerful. "You feel safe," she whispered, and I knew she wasn't saying it for my benefit. She was saying it because she had only just realized it herself. I didn't answer, not because I didn't want to, but because some words are too sacred to answer with noise, And so I let my hand gently rest against hers, fingers lightly brushing, and her shoulders relaxed as though my silence had been the right reply. She didn't offer another kiss, and I didn't ask for one because this wasn't about wanting more, it was about learning how to hold what we already had. Still, something in her posture had changed, something subtle, something that told me the walls she had spent years building weren't just lowered, they had been unlocked. We sat by the window in the pale morning light, neither ready to talk but both unwilling to lose the closeness we had found, that delicate space where silence didn't feel empty but full of the unspoken understanding that we had crossed a line that neither of us wanted to erase. And yet, I saw it, the flicker, faint but unmistakable, crossing her features like a passing shadow.
Fear.
Not of me, not of the connection between us, but of what it meant once morning turned into day, once doors opened, once perfection and expectation resumed their place in her world. She looked at the sunrise, then at our hands, and then finally at me, and said softly, "What happens now?" It was not a question of affection, but of consequence, of reputation, of exposure, of the cost of truth. And in that moment, I understood something painfully, beautifully real. She wasn't afraid of loving. She was afraid of being seen loving. So I didn't answer with reassurance or certainty. Instead, I spoke the only truth I had. We don't have to know that yet. Her shoulders dropped, tension loosening, relief flickering through her gaze, not because we had solved anything, but because we had allowed it not to be solved.
For now.
She stood slowly, moving toward the kettle, preparing more tea, even though we still had some from earlier, like the ritual itself, not the drink, grounded her back into something safe. But this time, she didn't stand across the kitchen from me. She stayed close, deliberately close, like proximity had become something she no longer needed to test, only trust. She handed me the cup, her fingers not letting go as quickly as they might have before, her touch lingering, soft, intentional. "Every time I let someone close," she murmured, "I end up watching them leave." The words weren't self-pitying. They weren't dramatic. They were simply tired. Honest. I shook my head gently. "Maybe," I said, "you never watched them leave. Maybe you stood still while they kept walking." She blinked, as though the thought had never occurred to her before, and something in her expression shifted, a realization slowly blooming, not painful, but clarifying. She didn't speak immediately, just studied me with a kind of quiet intensity, as though she wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for truth. And then, very softly, she asked, "Do you think I've been lonely because I kept people away? Or because I waited for someone who wouldn't leave?" And for the first time, I didn't just see vulnerability in her. I saw longing. Deep, aching, unspoken longing for realness, for presence, for choosing and being chosen without conditions. Something deep inside me stirred. Not the kind of stir that rushes toward action, but the kind that compels stillness, reverence, softness. I set my cup down slowly and took one small step closer, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to be felt. "I think," I whispered, "you've been waiting for someone willing to stay, even when it gets complicated." The air shifted again, quiet, tender, raw. She didn't say anything, but she looked at me like she was hearing words she didn't know she had been waiting for. She stepped closer, not carefully, but naturally, and lifted her hand to brush a strand of hair from my face, something that might have seemed casual if not for how lightly and deliberately she did it, like the touch itself meant something. Her fingers lingered, gently, near my temple, almost wondering whether to move further, whether to touch more. But she didn't.
Not yet.
"Instead," she whispered, "you scare me." I blinked, not expecting that. But her thumb softly traced my cheek and she added, "Not because I don't trust you. Because I do." My chest clenched, not painfully, but deeply, fully, like a door opening to a truth I hadn't realized mattered so much. So I didn't answer with words. I simply lifted my hand to meet hers, slowly covering her fingers where they rested at my jaw, and I held them there, not tightly, not possessively, but in acknowledgement, acceptance. And something in her posture dropped, softened, released. Like the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for all along wasn't the kiss, but this. The moment of being held, not physically, but emotionally, without expectation or requirement or timeline. Her eyes grew glossy, not with tears exactly, but with tenderness, something she had kept too long locked away. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "You don't have to," I whispered. "You just have to let it happen." It was strange, the way silence suddenly didn't feel fragile anymore. It felt warm, full, sturdy like a foundation. Something we could build on. Not perfect, not entirely safe, but real. Her hand left my face and found mine again instead, intertwining fully this time, palm to palm, finger to finger, no hesitation now, no accidental brushes or tentative contact. It felt like choosing. It felt like beginning. She didn't kiss me again. I didn't ask her to. It wasn't about that, not now. Not yet. It was about standing there, in a quiet kitchen, in soft morning light, and not running away from what had started to grow between us. And so we stood, hands held, hearts uncovered.
Fear not gone.
But fear no longer in control. We talked, not about romance, not about labels, not about what this meant in any official or future sense, but about her sister, her career, the cost of control, how it felt to be admired but never truly known. And somewhere in that conversation, somewhere between her saying, "I never knew I could be both soft and strong," and me responding, "You always were. You just forgot." Something in her finally broke, not in pain, but in relief. Because being known didn't hurt. It healed. As we stood there, still holding hands without thinking, I felt the morning light brighten slowly across her skin, and I realized this story would not be defined by how quickly we fell, but how deeply. And when she whispered barely above a breath, "Jordan, please don't disappear after this," I didn't need to think before answering. "I'm not going anywhere." And something in her, something deep, something silent, finally believed it. There was a different kind of quietness that evening, not like the quiet of emptiness or hesitation, but the quiet of choosing, the kind that fills the space between two people who are no longer afraid to be seen, no longer calculating how close they can safely stand without revealing too much, no longer hiding behind polite distance or professional masks. Not silence, but softness. Night had fallen again, but unlike the night before, it did not feel like the beginning of something unknown or uncertain. It felt like something we stepped into willingly, deliberately, like crossing the threshold of a decision neither of us had spoken out loud, but both of us understood. We hadn't left the house all day, not out of fear of the world, but because the house itself had become a world, one we were not ready to break by stepping outside. It wasn't claustrophobic. It was safe. Sacred somehow. Like the walls had heard things they weren't used to hearing, seen things they weren't used to seeing, and responded by softening themselves, inviting more. She had spent much of the day looking at me the way someone looks at something they are slowly learning to believe is real. Not with doubt. With wonder. With caution. Maybe with gratitude. She didn't touch me constantly. That wasn't her way. But the touches that did happen, the light brush of her fingers against the back of my hand when passing me tea, the accidental graze of her arm when reaching for something on the kitchen counter, the stillness she allowed when she stood close and didn't step away, each of those quiet moments felt like entire conversations. We moved around her house without agenda, sometimes speaking, sometimes not, sometimes laughing over something completely ordinary like how she forgot where her own kettle was kept or how she burned toast with absolute authority. I manage a multi-million-dollar enterprise but cannot control bread, and somehow, in those moments, she felt more impressive than she ever had in a boardroom. The most striking thing was watching her relax without asking permission from herself. Her hair loose, her laugh unmeasured, her posture softer, her gaze less guarded. At one point, I found her standing barefoot in the hallway next to a large mirror, staring not at her reflection but at her expression, like she'd barely recognized her own softness. She didn't apologize for it. She didn't turn away. She just looked. And when she saw me watching her, she didn't stiffen or lift her chin or return to the person the world expected. She simply let me come closer. "Do I look different to you?" she asked, softly, not vainly, not anxiously, but thoughtfully. I thought carefully. You look like someone who stopped waiting for permission to be herself. Her expression didn't break, didn't crumble. It opened. Just a little. That night, we returned to the glass room, the one she said she used to remember how to breathe, and sat not apart, but closer this time, naturally, as though distance no longer mattered the way it once had. There were no candles, no fireplace, just the moonlight resting on the glass, spilling gently across her hands as she turned them palm up, studying them quietly as though they belonged to someone else. And then, without ceremony or theatrics, she spoke.
Softly. Steadily.
My whole life I have been admired. I have been respected.
I have been feared.
But I have never been comfortable. She exhaled, slowly. Until now. I didn't respond quickly. Some truths aren't meant to be met with commentary. Some truths only ask for presence. I let silence honor it. Eventually, I said, barely above a whisper, comfort doesn't weaken power. She turned her head toward me, slowly. No.
No, I said.
It reveals it. Something unspoken passed between us then. Not a realization. A recognition. She didn't move closer intentionally. She simply stopped resisting how naturally her body gravitated toward mine. Our shoulders touched, not briefly, not accidentally, but softly, comfortably, as though they had always been meant to rest that close. The slight contact was enough to still my breath, enough to slow hers. I don't want a night to end, she whispered, not looking at me, looking instead at where our shoulders met. I don't either, I answered. And then, almost shyly, almost like I might have imagined it, she shifted, turning just enough so that her head gently, quietly, found its place against my shoulder. Not searching, not asking, just resting. And that, somehow, felt more intimate than any kiss could have been. Her breath slowed, syncing with mine. Her hands stayed folded in her lap for a while, then slowly, delicately, one found its way to where my hand rested on the soft blanket between us. Not grabbing, not claiming, just resting. And this time, I placed my hand over hers fully. Intentionally. Not gently brushing. Not pausing halfway. Palm to palm.
Warm. Real.
And she breathed, not shakily this time, not uncertainly, but deeply. With relief. It didn't feel tentative anymore. It felt right. Necessary. True. She didn't speak for a while. Neither did I. Words would have lessened it. But when she did finally speak, her voice wasn't weak or fragile. It was steady. Strong, but gently so. I don't want this to be just something that happened in this house, she said, as though stating not a request but a vow. Neither do I said. And I meant it more than any words I'd ever spoken. She lifted her head then, just enough to look at me, and the closeness felt different now, familiar, certain, alive. Her thumb grazed the side of my hand, soft, barely there, but intentional. And I knew, without her saying it, that this was not the beginning of desire. This was the beginning of belonging. She leaned in, not for a kiss, but because closeness was no longer a question, but a comfort. Her forehead rested lightly against mine, and the way she breathed felt like trust. There was no hesitation, no fear, only softness, only presence. It would have been easy to kiss her then. Too easy. But instead, we stayed like that, forehead to forehead, breath to breath, heart to heart, until I felt the warmth of something deeper than romance. Recognition. I have never let anyone see me the morning after, she whispered. It took me a moment to understand. And then, quietly, I said, then don't let this night end. She closed her eyes, inhaling not shakily but steadily. And when she opened them again, there was clarity, not boldness. Something stronger.
Choice.
Not passion. Something deeper.
Peace. She didn't speak.
She didn't explain. She simply intertwined our fingers again, the same way she had the night before, but this time, she didn't let go. She lifted our joined hands and held them to her heart, not dramatically, not symbolically, but instinctively, like the most natural answer to a question no one had needed to speak out loud. And then, softly, slowly, she said the truest words she had ever said in her life. "Stay the night with me." Not seductive. Not uncertain. Not impulsive.
Clear. Human. Honest.
The most intimate courage I had ever seen. And I didn't rush to answer. I didn't need to, because I had already stayed. With her. For her. In ways she hadn't even noticed. So I simply said, "I already am." And just that was enough. We didn't speak again for a long time. We didn't rush toward anything. Instead, she lay her head against my shoulder, our hands still joined, our breaths softly sinking, and we stayed like that until the moonlight turned to silver dawn once more. And this time, morning didn't feel like something that would end what we had. It felt like something we would finally begin together. I didn't expect her to take me to her bedroom. Not because it wasn't logical or appropriate to do so after she'd asked me to stay, but because the bedroom felt like the last place she would ever allow someone into, the final room of a home that was not built of walls and furniture, but of carefully maintained emotional distance. And yet, after a long and quiet moment in the glass room, she stood slowly, still holding my hand, and without speaking, began to lead me through the soft corridors of her house, not hesitating, not questioning, simply choosing. There was something different in the way she walked beside me now, not as a woman giving a tour of a home, not as a CEO walking through her private world, but as someone who had deliberately stopped performing for the world. There was no grand announcement, no significant pause when we reached the door, no dramatic exhale before she opened it. She just pushed the door gently and let me walk into the space that seemed entirely unlike the rest of the house. It was not large, not overly polished, not designed for display. It looked lived in, quiet, soft, human. A cream-colored comforter rested on a slightly rumpled bed, not staged like a magazine photo, but shaped by real sleep, real nights. There was a lamp on the nightstand, books stacked unorganized, two on the floor with folded pages that made me smile because I never imagined Evelyn Montgomery to be someone who bent page corners, and yet somehow it made sense, like it matched the kind of hidden softness I was only beginning to see. Near the window, long curtains hung open, letting in the last traces of moonlight and the early hint of dawn, casting a glow that didn't illuminate the room but cushioned it in pale silver. She didn't explain the room. She didn't justify why it was not immaculate like the rooms the world had seen in magazine interviews or photo tours. She simply stood there, breathing slowly, as though the mere fact of standing in that space with someone else felt significant enough. I didn't speak. It felt like sacred ground, not because of the room itself, but because of what it represented. She walked toward the bed, then paused, hands gently pressed against the end of the comforter, but she didn't sit yet. She looked at the window, then at her feet, then finally at me. "I've never had anyone in this room," she said softly, not dramatically, just simply. I didn't answer right away. I let that truth settle into the air, honoring its weight. Not because it meant I was special, not because it felt flattering, but because it meant that this wasn't an accident or a moment she would later compartmentalize. This was intention. This was choice. Then why now? I asked quietly, not accusing, not rushing, just asking the question that hung between us. She didn't turn away, didn't retreat behind defenses or clever responses. She stood there, eyes steady, softer than they had been hours ago, and whispered, "Because for the first time, I don't feel like I have to prepare myself before someone sees me." My heart felt that before my mind understood it. She wasn't letting me into her room. She was letting herself be seen in it. Unarranged, unedited, uncurated. "You don't plan this," she added, voice trembling just slightly. "You just feel it." And she paused, letting the words find their own shape. "I just feel safe." The word safe felt heavier than any romantic declaration could have. Safe meant something more than comfort. Safe meant surrender, without losing oneself. Safe meant trust. She finally sat on the bed, not elegantly, not posed, but naturally, like someone who was tired from holding up iron walls for too many years. I sat beside her, not too close at first, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her presence. There was silence, but not the silence of uncertainty or hesitation. It was the silence of arrival, of something real unfolding. "What scares you most?" I asked gently, not because I needed an answer, but because I could feel that she needed to say it. She looked down at her hands, then at the soft fabric beneath her, tracing a corner of the blanket with her fingertips the way someone traces a memory. "That I won't know how to be loved without performing for it," she whispered. It felt like something breaking and healing all at once. I didn't move closer yet. I let her feel it, let her hear her own truth, without me rushing to comfort it away. "But you didn't perform tonight," I said softly. "No," she whispered, lifting her eyes to meet mine. "I didn't." And then she added, almost disbelieving, "And you stayed." That was when I moved closer, just enough for my knee to touch hers, but not enough to overwhelm. "I will keep staying," I whispered. She didn't cry, but there was a softness in her expression that felt like a kind of relief tears couldn't capture. She reached up, slowly, uncertainly, and touched my face, not like before, not like a hesitant brush of fingers or a trembling question, but like a memorization, a touch that meant I am allowing this, I am choosing this. And when I lifted my hand to gently cover hers, she let it remain there, willingly. Her thumb softly moved across my cheekbone, and she said, "I don't know how to ask you to stay without sounding like I need you in ways that scare me." I held her hand against my skin, not tightly, but fully. "Needing someone isn't weakness," I said. "It's truth." She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing that. When she opened them, she didn't look afraid. She looked ready. "Then stay," she whispered. "Not just tonight, but through the parts that aren't pretty. Through the parts where I might not know how to be soft. Through the parts where I might still want to run back into perfection." I didn't speak. I simply moved closer, fully this time, and wrapped my arm around her, gently, securely, like something that had both tenderness and strength. And she allowed it. Or rather, she leaned into it. She rested her head against my shoulder, slower than before, and this time there was no question in her movement, no hesitancy. Only trust. Only presence. My arms wrapped around her carefully, intentionally, with the kind of embrace that promises not to rush, not to take, but to stay. She melted, not dramatically, not brokenly, but quietly into me. And that was the most intimate thing that had happened so far. We stayed like that for a long time. The moonlight dimmed. The room darkened. We sat in the growing tranquility, holding each other, breathing in the same rhythm without meaning to, until her breath softened, her shoulders loosened, and she exhaled a long, deep sigh that felt like the release of years of holding her breath. "You feel like rest," she whispered, voice fading into tiredness, into something peaceful. "You feel like home," I whispered back. And I meant it. Not because of walls and furniture. Because of her. She lay down slowly, not pulling away, but pulling me gently with her, not to turn the moment into something it wasn't, but to simply remain close, held, unafraid. We lay there facing each other, eyes half closed, hands still entwined between us. She watched me for a long time, like she was memorizing not my face, but the feeling of not being alone. Just before sleep found her, she whispered in the quietest voice I had ever heard from her, "I didn't think peace would feel like this." And I whispered back, "What does it feel like?" Her eyes fluttered, soft and steady, her hand finding my wrist, resting there with quiet certainty. "Like I'm allowed to exist," she said. And then, in my arms, in her room, with her heart calm and her breath steady, Evelyn Montgomery fell asleep. And for the first time in her life, she did not build a wall in her dreams. Morning sunlight didn't break harshly into the room but arrived gently, like a soft exhale after a long, deep breath, touching the edges of the curtains, tracing the shape of the comforter, slowly making its way toward where we lay, and for a long, quiet moment I didn't move because I didn't want to disturb whatever sacredness had settled in the room during the night. I wasn't sure if she was awake until I felt the slightest shift in her breathing, slower, more conscious, and then something soft happened, before opening her eyes, before lifting her head, her fingers, without hesitation or searching, found my hand beneath the covers, not tentatively as before, not testing the closeness, but naturally, instinctively, like they had always known where to go. And that, more than any kiss, more than any confession, felt like the truest moment so far. She didn't open her eyes right away.
She didn't speak.
She simply held my hand, loosely but intentionally, with the kind of ease that could only come from deep trust, and when her thumb began to trace soft, barely there circles against my skin, I realized this wasn't nervous affection. This was comfort. This was a woman who was not performing tenderness. She was living it. When she finally opened her eyes, she didn't look startled or self-conscious at the proximity. She didn't adjust the blanket or shift away in automatic caution. She simply looked at me, tired, calm, unguarded, and then something I had never seen before appeared on her face. Not the small private smiles from before, not the controlled, polite ones she used at work, but something raw and unpolished. A morning smile. Real, unedited, slow, warm. It felt like being chosen. "Good morning," she whispered, and I realized this was the first time either of us had said it not as courtesy, but as discovery. "Good morning," I murmured, and she looked at me like the words meant something more than acknowledgement. She didn't rush to sit up, didn't reach for perfection. She stayed resting on her side, head against the pillow, hair slightly messy from sleep, eyes soft, hand still in mine. It felt like the kind of morning that belonged only to people who had truly been present for the night before. "I don't remember the last time I woke up calm," she said softly, as though she were still testing the meaning of the word. I didn't answer right away because her voice didn't want reassurances. It wanted recognition. "Maybe it's because you didn't wake up alone," I said. She didn't reply immediately. She didn't look away. She just held my gaze, then, slowly, she nodded, not in agreement, but in acceptance. And I knew that was a bigger step than any kiss. Silence settled between us again, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything we might have said didn't need words yet. She shifted slightly, and for the first time, without fear or hesitation, she moved closer, not discreetly, not cautiously, but with intention, resting her head gently against my shoulder, her hand still in mine. Our legs brushed under the covers, soft and unplanned, and I felt her relax into the touch rather than retreat from it. Warmth. Closeness.
Safety.
She wasn't thinking. She was simply being. That felt like the greatest change of all. After a while, I felt her smile, not because she was amused, but because she had allowed comfort to reach her. She spoke eventually, voice quiet, full of new softness. "I don't know what this is supposed to look like," she murmured, thumbs still brushing idle patterns against my wrist. "Me neither," I confessed. "But I know what it feels like."
She looked at me.
"What does it feel like?" I inhaled slowly, gently, like something worth protecting. Something shifted in her gaze then, something tender but also alert, like the beginning of understanding. Protecting. Not hiding. Not denying. Protecting. Liking something enough to keep it safe, not out of fear but out of care. She nodded once, very slowly, like she wasn't just agreeing, but absorbing. And then, very quietly, deliberately, she rested her forehead against mine. No hesitation. No trembling. Just closeness. For the first time, it didn't feel uncertain. It felt earned. We stayed like that for a long time, not kissing, not speaking, not needing anything except the quiet assurance of breath and warmth. But then, slowly, deliberately, reality began to seep into the morning, not through fear or urgency, but through life returning gently to the edges of the world. Somewhere outside, I heard the soft buzz of her phone vibrating from another room. Once. Then again. She didn't move, but her eyes opened, and I knew, we both knew, that the world had noticed her absence. That perfection was calling her back. That someone, somewhere, was waiting for Evelyn Montgomery, CEO. Not Evelyn with messy hair and a soft morning heartbeat and someone's hand in hers. I felt her body tighten, not with dread, but with awareness. And she whispered, that will be the world asking where I am. I nodded slowly, noticing how she did not let go of my hand. Let it wait, I whispered. She didn't smile. She didn't laugh. Instead, she nodded slowly, carefully. Then, and this was maybe the most intimate thing she had done yet, she placed my hand gently against her heart. Without fear. Without embarrassment. Without explanation. Just truth. I don't want to lose this, she whispered. Her heartbeat beneath my palm was unsteady but strong. You won't, I whispered back, not as assurance, but as promise. Not if you choose it outside this room the way you choose it inside. The way she looked at me then, God, it felt like she was choosing. Actively. Silently. Completely. And yet, honesty returned, the kind that had made this real in the first place. She whispered, "It won't be easy." I nodded. Nothing true ever is. Silence again. Breathing. Warmth. Her eyes lifted toward the closed bedroom door, where reality waited. Then back to me, where something softer and more dangerous waited. But I want to try, she said. I want to learn how to exist in both worlds, without losing myself or losing this. And that was not fear. That was courage. She didn't get up immediately. She didn't rush to dress or adjust her hair or become the woman the world expected. She stayed a few more minutes, letting morning exist slowly, gently, truthfully. But eventually, she did rise, not as escape, but as acceptance. She stood barefoot beside the bed, hair undone, sweater slightly rumpled, and for the first time, she didn't look like two different versions of herself. She looked like one woman who had finally decided she didn't need armor to be strong. She walked to the mirror, not to fix herself, not to perform, but to see herself. Really see. And she didn't flinch. When she turned back to me, she reached out, not tentatively, not cautiously, but openly, palm up, like an invitation. Not for the night. Not for the morning. For what came after. Come downstairs with me? She asked gently. I stood slowly, walked toward her, and when I reached her, I didn't say yes with words because that felt too small. Instead, I simply slipped my hand into hers. And this time, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't careful. It wasn't hidden. It was seen. Real. Chosen. We opened the bedroom door together. And for the first time, she didn't walk out alone. There was something different about the hallway when we walked through it this time, hand in hand not by accident but by decision, something different about the silence too, like the house had felt the shift in us and adjusted to accommodate it, less like a space we were passing through, and more like something bearing witness. The world outside had begun knocking quietly, not yet demanding, but reminding. The buzz of her phone came again from somewhere on a console downstairs, followed by another, slightly more insistent, but she didn't speed up or tense. Instead, she held my hand a little more firmly, as though not resisting the call of reality, but refusing to answer it alone. We stepped into the kitchen, and morning light had settled fully in the space now, far brighter than the night before, but not unkind. It softened the marble countertops, glowed across stainless steel and pale oak, catching dust in the air that made everything look almost impossibly peaceful for a place about to be interrupted. The phone buzzed again. She didn't let go of my hand when she reached for it with the other. She glanced at the screen, and I saw the name, Daniel Hayes, her chief of operations. She looked at me, not asking permission, not explaining, just looking, and it was enough. She answered. Daniel, she said, and there it was, the CEO voice, except it wasn't exactly the same. It had that calm authority, that unmistakable steadiness, but it was different somehow. Less sharp, less rehearsed. Human. We're confirming final arrivals for this afternoon. Daniel's crisp voice came through, and your sister's flight landed early. I've arranged a car, and I've sent the catering updates to your personal email. Also, the board wants to, she interrupted gently. Daniel. Her tone didn't correct him. It guided him. For a breath, silence. Then his voice softened. Are you all right? And it was strange how intimate that question felt, coming from someone not in the room. She answered simply, I'm fine. But her eyes were not on the kitchen or the phone. They were on me. I'll be there by noon. She paused, then, purposefully and without explanation, she added, I have someone with me. Daniel said nothing at first. Then, softly, shall I prepare accordingly?
No, she said.
I will. She ended the call. Silence returned, but it wasn't the silence of stepping away from something fragile. It was the silence of stepping toward something unknown. But not alone. She set the phone down and finally did release my hand, but not to step aside. She held onto my fingertips for just a moment longer before letting them slip away, slow, intentional, deeply felt. That, she said quietly, was the first time I didn't pretend to be alone. My chest tightened, not in heartache, but in awe. We made breakfast, not like we had the night before, improvising messily in midnight softness, but calmly, comfortably, moving around each other with unspoken coordination, familiar now, less hesitant, instinctive. It wasn't special like the pancakes at 3 a.m. It was something different, natural. I scrambled eggs. She poured coffee. She didn't dress up, didn't fix her hair, didn't pull herself back into the immaculate armor the world knew. She remained barefoot, sweater slightly wrinkled, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. At one moment, she reached for the mug near me, and her hand brushed my waist, not intentionally, not accidentally either. She didn't flinch when she realized. Instead, she let her hand linger just a second longer than necessary, gently, confidently, like she was learning not to apologize for wanting closeness when it felt right. We sat at the small table by the window, and she ate quietly, peacefully, like someone who had not rushed through a morning meal in years. After a moment, she spoke calmly. There will be people here soon. I nodded. I know. They won't expect to see me like this. I nodded again. I know. She looked at me, not with fear, but with reflection. I don't want to become someone else when they arrive. That, I realized then, was the battle. Not between us. Not between desire and responsibility, but between wholeness and perfection. Between being seen fully and being seen only as expected. Then don't, I said softly. She didn't smile at that. Not because she disagreed. Because she was thinking. Because she was considering what it would mean to live that truth. Because people like her don't need smiles to show agreement. They need silence. She finished her coffee, then stood. I want to show you something. She gestured to the side door that led to a different wing of the house, one I hadn't seen. I followed without question. She led me to a room I hadn't expected. Not an office, not a study, but something softer. A music room. A piano stood near a tall window overlooking the garden. Not glamorous like the rest of the house. Not designed for guests. It felt lived in.
Used. Real.
I play when I can't think, she said, walking to the piano. She rested her fingers on the keys, not pressing, just touching. Or, when I don't want to.
I didn't speak.
She sat slowly, then after a moment, motioned for me to sit beside her. Not in a chair. Right next to her. On the same bench. She began to play, not a song, not a performance. Just notes. Quiet, slow, thoughtful. And I realized she wasn't playing something she had practiced. She was playing something she felt. It was delicate, hesitant in places, certain in others. Like her. After a moment she stopped. Not because she was done. Because she needed to say something. I've spent my whole life performing, she whispered. Even when I wasn't on stage. I said nothing. She paused. But this, I don't want to perform. Her voice softened. I want to live it. And then, she lifted her hand from the piano, turned toward me, slowly, hesitantly, but with unmistakable intention, and placed it gently over mine where it rested on my lap. Not by accident, not briefly, but fully. And in that moment I realized, this wasn't about romance. This wasn't even about love. This was about identity. About choosing to exist unedited. And offering someone else a place in that existence. And that, more than any affection, felt like intimacy. We sat there until we heard the first sounds of arriving cars outside. Voices. Movement. The world was coming. She heard it. I heard it. She didn't pull her hand away. She held it just a little tighter and whispered, "I want to walk downstairs with you." "As Evelyn the CEO?" I asked. She shook her head gently. "As Evelyn." We stood. We walked. Not quickly. Not timidly. Side by side. And when we reached the top of the staircase, she didn't look down at the people beginning to enter. She looked at me. And for the first time since I had known her, she looked ready to step into her world without leaving herself behind.
Or me.
And then she said, softly but clearly, "Whatever happens now, let it be real." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a declaration. It was a beginning. And when we stepped down together, she didn't let go of my hand. The moment we stepped down the staircase, the house felt different, not because anything supernatural had changed, not because the decor or lighting or architecture had transformed, but because for the first time, she was walking through it not as the perfect, composed CEO, not as the woman built from marble and control, but as Evelyn, barefoot in a soft sweater, hair unfastened, holding someone's hand without concealing it. There were people in the entry hall now, staff, catering teams, decorators, assistants, arriving early to finalize arrangements for the afternoon's Thanksgiving dinner, and I saw the flicker of surprise in their eyes when they looked up and saw her. Not the kind of surprise that comes from scandal or shock, but something quieter, something like I've never seen her look this human. The whispers did not begin, not yet. No one would dare. But something shifted in the room. A recalibration. An adjustment of what people thought they knew. She didn't try to hide me. She didn't release my hand when a woman approached, mid-30s, clipboard in hand, clearly startled to realize Evelyn was not upstairs, perfectly dressed, prepared. "Ms. Montgomery," she said, almost hesitating. We weren't expecting you down yet." Evelyn didn't respond sharply. She didn't straighten her spine into corporate posture. She simply nodded, calmly. "Good morning," she said, with no attempt to appear aloof or distant. That alone made the woman blink. Then she noticed our hands. Her eyes widened, not in judgment, but in realization. And it was then, right then, that Evelyn did something I didn't expect. She let go of my hand, but not to hide anything. She did it so she could step slightly forward, standing fully in view, not half behind me or beside me, but directly in front of them all, saying without words, "I am not hiding. Not today." She spoke to the woman, who I later learned was named Anna, giving instructions for the dinner, her tone measured but warm, undeniably present. And I noticed something. She was still every bit the leader, still entirely in command. But the ice was gone. The intentional distance she always maintained, it was gone. She gave orders, but she listened. She let Anna finish her sentences. She said, "Thank you. Real thank you." When she finished, she turned, not out of her role, not away from the event, but toward me, as though to silently say, "I haven't forgotten you, even while I'm being her." And then, without hesitation, without fear, without scanning the room to see who was watching, she reached for my hand again. This time, she didn't look down before taking it. She didn't check if it was appropriate, visible, risky. She just did it. And something inside me knew, this is what choosing looks like. As more people arrived, the atmosphere shifted gradually. Not into gossip or whispers, but into silent awareness. Evelyn Montgomery was not alone. The house manager, the decorators, the executive director, people who saw her every year from a safe emotional distance, now saw something new. She was not bringing a plus one. She was not hiding a lover in a back room. She was, for the first time, allowing someone to stand beside her, not behind, not at a careful distance. Beside. Then came the moment I secretly feared and silently anticipated, the arrival of her sister, Grace. The front door opened, laughter spilled in, the natural kind, surprised and light. A woman entered, similarity visible in the eyes, but softer, warmer, carrying a coat in one arm and a bag in the other, speaking to someone behind her. She wasn't alone. A tall man followed, her husband, I later learned, holding a suitcase, smiling, clearly comfortable in the house. Familiar with it. Familiar with her. Then she looked up. And there Evelyn was. Not poised in perfect attire. Not standing tall and untouchable. But barefoot, hair loose, casual clothes. And, most noticeably, holding my hand. There was a silence then. Not uncomfortable. Not judgmental. But full of realization. A sister noticing something different before anyone else would dare to name it. Grace didn't speak immediately. She looked at Evelyn, not at me. Not at our hands. At her. Really at her. And I saw it. The slight widening of her eyes. Not in shock, but in something like relief. Like finally. She dropped her coat softly and walked toward her slowly. Not smiling, not confronting, just observing. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, I felt history moving between them. Long-lived questions. Long-held secrets. Long-avoided truths. Grace stepped closer. I held my breath, not from fear of being judged, but from fear that this would change the moment. Grace didn't look at me when she reached us. She kept looking at Evelyn, studying her face. And then, softly, she smiled. Not a casual smile. Not a polite smile. A knowing one. A sister's smile. You look rested, Grace said quietly. Evelyn exhaled. Not shakily. Not nervously. Just honestly. I am, she said. Grace's eyes flickered to me, then back to her sister. Not suspiciously. Not curiously. But knowingly. Good, she said. And that was all. Evelyn didn't let go of my hand. In fact, I felt her grip tighten just barely. Only enough for me to feel it. Only enough to tell me, I am not afraid of being seen. Not anymore. The morning moved gently into afternoon, and preparations filled the house. But unlike most event days, Evelyn didn't hide in her office or stay in constant motion. She moved more slowly, with intention, choosing when to speak and when to observe, occasionally brushing her hand against mine or pausing near me, not constantly, not performatively, but naturally, as though I had not been invited to her world, but had become part of it. And then, the moment came that felt small yet enormous. 2 caterers stood quietly in the corner, unsure how to approach her, uncertain whether she was in CEO mode or personal host mode, and before they could overthink it, Evelyn walked toward them, not with cold grace, not with tight posture, but warmly, gently, thanking them for their work. One of them, a young woman, stuttered slightly, clearly nervous to speak to her. Evelyn didn't wait for her to form her words. Instead, she said something no one expected. You can call me Evelyn, she told her. Not Ms. Montgomery. Not ma'am. Evelyn. The young woman blinked, unsure how to respond, nodded shyly and smiled. Evelyn smiled back, and I realized it wasn't about staff or hierarchy. It was about letting people see her without a title, without armor, without performing. Later, as final touches were made in the dining room and evening began to settle across the house in rich amber tones, blinking candles reflected against the long table's polished silver, and the hum of quiet conversation filled the air, Evelyn stood beside me again, not perfectly still, not nervously fidgeting, but simply present. She walked toward the grand mirror near the fireplace, where the last of the daylight fell across her hair, catching strands of gold and chestnut, and she did something I never expected her to do in front of anyone. She laughed. Softly. Freely. Without covering her mouth, without stiffening her posture, without performing elegance. Just laughing. Because she felt like it. Grace watched from across the room, then glanced at me. She didn't say anything.
She didn't need to.
The approval didn't come in words. It came in the way she relaxed her shoulders, the way she smiled gently, the way she nodded to herself as though something important had finally fallen into place. On the surface, this part of the day did not look dramatic. There were no public announcements, no scenes, no confessions. But something irreversible had happened in that house. For the first time, Evelyn did not turn into someone else in front of others. She did not retreat. She did not hide. She remained wholly, entirely softly herself, and she did it while standing next to me. And that, itself, was an act of love. Not performed love. Not declared love. Chosen love. Seen love. By evening, when the first guests began to arrive, Coats being taken, greetings exchanged. I watched as she stood by the entryway, still barefoot, still natural, not slipping into the polished armor of the woman the world expected. People hesitated when they saw her, thinking they had arrived too early, thinking she wasn't ready. But she simply said, "Welcome," with a voice so warm it surprised even them. She didn't keep me behind her. She didn't leave me at the edge of the room. When formal introductions began, she did something subtle but undeniable. She did not present me as her employee. She did not introduce me only by name. She simply, naturally, kept me beside her, looked at me when someone asked a question, included me in conversations not as decoration, not as secret, but as part of her. And maybe that was the most profound thing of all, that she wasn't trying to make a statement.
She simply stopped trying to hide.
And that, more than any speech or declaration, was the closest she had ever come to saying, "This is someone who matters to me. And I am not afraid to let you see it." But the night was just beginning, and the world was still just outside the door. The dining room didn't feel like a ballroom or a stage or a boardroom, though in the past, it had been used as all three, transformed for speeches, negotiations, social performances, carefully curated appearances. Tonight, it felt different, not because of the decor or lighting, not because of the expensive candle arrangements or the soft jazz playing from the speakers, but because of something quieter, something subtle, almost invisible, except in the way she stood near me, without tension in her shoulders, without distance in her stance, fully herself in a room full of people who had never seen her like this. Guests continued to arrive, some already familiar, some meeting her for the first time, but every arrival came with the same brief pause, a moment of disorientation as they registered her, barefoot, hair softly tucked back but not styled, wearing a deep, warm gray sweater instead of her usual structured attire. No mask, no armor, still powerful, still composed, but unguarded. No one dared comment at first, but people noticed. She greeted her board members calmly, not performatively, not sharp or precise, but warmly, as though she had finally learned how to speak without managing every syllable. She spoke to her aunt, then her godfather, then a longtime investor, and in every interaction, she did something entirely new. She did not detach. She did not control the space. She simply existed in it, with me beside her. I didn't blend into the background like guests assumed I would. She didn't place me behind her like someone partially included. She didn't present me to the room with a title or a label. She simply kept me near her, not in the center of attention, but in the center of her awareness. There was a point, during early conversation, when one older guest approached her, shook her hand, and said, Evelyn, I see you're entertaining a more relaxed holiday this year." She smiled gently, without explaining, without excusing. "Something like that," she said, and her eyes flickered toward me, soft but unmistakably intentional. That was the first moment I saw it in other people's eyes, the realization that I was not simply a guest, not a colleague, not an acquaintance, something else, something significant. But she didn't give them an answer. She didn't rush to define it. She simply let it be seen. The dinner bell chimed softly, and people began to take their seats along the long table, and this year, for the first time in years, she didn't sit at the head. She paused subtly, eyes scanning the room with an unreadable expression, and then she walked, not to the head seat, but to one beside the middle, and she sat there. Grace watched this from across the room, smiled slowly, knowingly, and took the seat on Evelyn's other side. I sat beside Evelyn. No one questioned it. No one interrupted it. Some noticed it. No one dared to rearrange it. Candlelight captured her features in a way I had never seen before, not sharp and defined like in boardrooms and magazine covers, but gently illuminated, softened not by makeup or filters, but by presence. She wasn't performing stillness. She was simply still. She didn't glance at me constantly. I wasn't her focus. But I was her anchor. And everyone saw. When the plates were served, when the soft hum of conversation began to fill the room, she didn't lead it. She didn't dominate it. She participated in it. And she did something that made even Grace pause in quiet awe. she laughed. Not politely. Not carefully. Not executively.
Softly.
Freely. And it wasn't because of something I said. It wasn't because of pressure or effort or social expectation. It was because she felt like laughing. And that, more than any admission, was change. The table noticed. Heads turned. People smiled, not politely but warmly. Someone said, "It's been a long time since I've heard that." She didn't apologize.
She didn't deflect.
She simply looked down, brushed her hair back, and kept smiling. But then came the moment I had known was coming. The moment of definition, not one I asked for, not one I wanted forced, but one the room silently waited for. The moment someone would ask the question the evening itself seemed to hold. It was subtle, almost gentle, when it happened. After dinner, in soft clusters of casual conversation, an older woman, elegant, composed, clearly comfortable in Evelyn's presence, approached with warmth, not intrusion, looked at both of us and said, "Evelyn, my dear, you've hardly left her side all evening. Will you introduce us?" It wasn't interrogation. It wasn't confrontation. It was curiosity, softened with genuine affection. Evelyn didn't tense. She didn't retreat. I felt her breath slow, steady. She stepped a little closer to me, not dramatically, not possessively, just naturally, and for a moment, she didn't speak. She looked at me, not for help, not for approval, but because she wanted me there when she answered. She turned back to the woman, and then, in the simplest, clearest, most quietly powerful way, she said, "This is Jordan." Just that. No last name. No title. No explanation. Just my name. The woman nodded gently, then waited. But she didn't elaborate. Evelyn wasn't finished. Her fingers brushed mine, not hidden, not intertwined, just present. And then she added, calmly, steadily, voice soft but deliberate, "She's here with me. Not employee.
Not guest.
Not friend. With me." The woman smiled, a deep, understanding smile, and reached out to shake my hand. "Then I am very glad you're here," she said. As she walked away, Evelyn didn't move her hand from beside mine. She looked at me, not seeking validation, not apologizing, just looking. Like she had finally put something down she had been carrying for years. Like something inside her had exhaled. The night moved forward, not with grand declarations or romantic displays, but with something deeper. Her presence, beside me, unchanged, unhidden, whole. She didn't announce anything. She didn't need to. She simply lived it. And in doing so, she let others see it. Not for them. For herself. Later, when the last guests had left and the candles had burned low, when the chandeliers dimmed and the house fell into a hush of post-celebration quiet, we stood in the now empty dining room, shoes kicked off, formalities long gone. She walked to the head of the table, touched the back of the chair she used to occupy, then looked back at me standing in the middle of the room. Her expression was unreadable, but not guarded, just present. She walked back, slowly, until she was close enough to feel the warmth between us, but not so close that she didn't still have to choose. Then she whispered, "I don't want to sit there anymore." And I understood. It wasn't about the chair. It was about the life that came with it, the solitude, the expectations, the performance. And she was saying, "I can still lead. I can still be her. But I don't want to lead alone." I took a step closer.
She didn't retreat.
She didn't second-guess. She simply let her hand find mine, naturally, calmly, and I realized something powerful. We weren't falling in love. We were arriving in it, not in a rush, not in fireworks, but by staying, by not retreating, by showing up fully, imperfectly, truthfully. She looked at me, barely smiling, a kind of wonder in her eyes, and said, for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to disappear to be happy. And I didn't say anything because sometimes love isn't something you say back. It's something you know, something you choose, something you stay for. She lifted my hand and pressed it not against her heart, but between both of hers. Holding it, not claiming,
Not promising.
just holding. Present.
True.
Enough. And in the quiet of that late evening, in the house that had once felt too large for any real emotion and too elegant for any real laughter, a woman who had spent her life being seen by everyone but known by no one, stood barefoot, sweater soft, holding someone's hand, without fear. That was the love story. Not confessions. Not declarations. Not perfection. Just two people choosing to be real. And choosing to be real next to each other. Thank you so much for being here and for believing in this channel. If you feel in your heart, you can donate with super thanks so I can focus more and more on this project. Your support helps me keep creating these love stories and bringing them to life for you. See you in the next video.